Snow falls quietly over St. Petersburg in the early 18th century, settling on the shoulders of soldiers lined outside the Winter Palace. And in the middle of that frozen court stands a young African boy dressed in Russian noble attire, his skin dark against the pale marble and white sky, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the towering figure of Tsar Peter the Great, who calls him forward, not as a servant, but as a godson. No one in this city looks like him. No one shares his origin. He was taken from Africa as a child, transported through the Ottoman Empire, and delivered as a diplomatic gift to the Russian court. And yet here he stands, educated, baptized, renamed Abram Petrovich Ganable. Stay with this story, because by the end you'll understand how this single life would echo across centuries, and how Russia, from empire to superpower, would later present itself as an alternative home for people the West had enslaved or colonized. But first, you have to understand how extraordinary this moment was. Ganable's early origins are debated by historians. Some place his birth in the region of present-day Cameroon. Others suggest the Horn of Africa. But what is documented is this. As a child, he was removed from his homeland, passed through Constantinople, and eventually brought to Russia around 1704. Peter the Great, obsessed with westernization and modernization, took a personal interest in him. Unlike the Atlantic slave systems that reduced Africans to plantation labor, Russia had no comparable overseas slave economy. Its exploitation system was serfdom, brutal, binding millions of peasants to land. But racially structured chattel slavery, as practiced in the Americas, did not define Russian society. Ganable was baptized into the Orthodox Church. Peter became his patron. He was sent to France for military education, studying engineering and artillery. He returned not as a curiosity, but as a trained specialist in fortifications. Over decades, he rose through the ranks of the Russian military, eventually becoming a general and a nobleman. He owned estates. He commanded respect. His descendants would integrate into the Russian aristocracy. One of them, generations later, would be Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet. But do not mistake Ganable's ascent for a racial revolution. He was exceptional. His rise reflected Peter's personal patronage and fascination with Western ideas, not a sweeping imperial embrace of African people. Imperial Russia did not suddenly open its borders to black migrants. There was no mass movement, no demographic shift. Ganable remained a rarity in a largely homogeneous empire. His story symbolized possibility, but it did not represent policy. And yet symbols matter. In a Europe deeply entangled in the Atlantic slave trade, where millions were forced into plantation systems, Russia's imperial structure operated differently. It did not build Caribbean colonies. It did not depend on African slave labor for overseas sugar or cotton. Its hierarchy was rigid, aristocratic, and oppressive, but organized along estate and class more than race. That distinction would later become useful, because centuries after Ganable stood in that frozen court, a new Russian state would emerge. One that rejected monarchy, denounced imperialism, and sought allies far beyond Europe. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they inherited an empire fractured by war and inequality. They declared themselves enemies of colonial exploitation. They spoke of solidarity with oppressed peoples worldwide. Through the Communist International, the Comintern, Moscow began reaching out to anti-colonial activists across Asia and Africa. The language was ideological, anti-imperialism, equality, liberation from Western domination. For newly colonized and exploited nations, that message carried weight. In the decades that followed, especially after World War II, as European colonial empires began to collapse, African nations emerged into independence amid Cold War rivalry. And the Soviet Union saw opportunity. Not simply moral opportunity, but geopolitical opportunity. Where Western powers had ruled through colonial administration, Moscow offered something different. Military training, educational scholarships, infrastructure assistance, and ideological partnership. It framed itself not as colonizer, but as comrade. In 1960, the People's Friendship University was founded in Moscow, later named after Congolese independence leader Patrice Lumumba. Its mission was explicit: educate students from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Thousands of African students would study engineering, medicine, and political science in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. To many, Moscow presented itself as a place where colonial hierarchies did not dominate public rhetoric. But just as Ganable's rise did not transform Imperial Russia into a racially open society, Soviet anti-colonial solidarity carried complexity beneath its ideals. African students in Moscow sometimes faced racism from citizens unaccustomed to diversity. Soviet support for African liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia was strategic as much as ideological. Military advisors weapons shipments and training programs served Cold War competition against the United States and former European colonial powers. The pattern across centuries is not simple racial openness, it is strategic positioning. Gannibal symbolized imperial modernity under Peter the Great, proof that Russia could cultivate talent beyond traditional European aristocracy. 2 centuries later, Soviet outreach to Africa symbolized ideological modernity, proof that Moscow could stand as an alternative to Western dominance. In both cases, the gesture carried meaning beyond the individual. An African boy at the Winter Palace, African students walking through Red Square, 2 images separated by centuries, both powerful, both real, both complicated. And if you look closely, you begin to see that Russia's relationship with people of African descent was never defined by large populations or consistent inclusion policy, but by moments, symbolic, strategic, sometimes sincere, sometimes instrumental, that revealed how power adapts its language across time. From imperial anomaly to Cold War alliance, the story is less about openness and more about positioning. And positioning, in geopolitics, can shape the world. The image of Abram Gannibal standing beside Peter the Great lingers like a portrait hung in a gilded hall, striking, memorable, but solitary. And if you step outside that frame and walk through the streets of 18th century Russia, you will not find a wave of African merchants settling in Moscow, nor communities forming along the Neva River, nor imperial decrees inviting black migration into the empire. You will find instead a society structured by rank, estate, and class, bound by serfdom, governed by Orthodox tradition, and overwhelmingly Slavic in composition. And this contrast matters, because it forces you to confront the difference between an extraordinary life and a systemic policy. Imperial Russia did not build a racial ideology around blackness the way Atlantic empires did, but it also did not cultivate a multiracial society. Africans remained rare, often appearing at court as servants, musicians, or diplomatic curiosities. And even Gannibal's ascent depended not on institutional inclusion, but on the personal favor of a reform-minded czar who sought to modernize Russia by borrowing from Europe and showcasing unusual talent. His rise told Europe that Russia was sophisticated, worldly, capable of absorbing difference, but it did not translate into open borders or racial equality within the empire. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Russia expanded territorially across Eurasia, absorbing diverse peoples in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Siberia. And yet, its engagement with Africa remained distant, indirect, and diplomatic rather than migratory. Trade existed. Naval voyages reached Mediterranean and African ports, but there was no sustained African presence shaping Russian society. Even Alexander Pushkin, Gannibal's great-grandson, whose lineage connected Russia's literary soul to Africa, wrote about identity and ancestry within a culture that still viewed blackness as rare and exotic. The empire's primary labor system was serfdom, abolished only in 1861, and millions of Russian peasants were bound to land in conditions that shocked Western observers. Oppression was real, but it was not organized along the racial hierarchies that defined plantation slavery in the Americas. That distinction would later allow Russian and then Soviet leaders to frame their nation as fundamentally different from Western colonial powers, arguing that they had not participated in the Atlantic slave trade and therefore carried no comparable legacy of racial exploitation in Africa. But absence of colonial plantations did not equal a doctrine of racial harmony. Imperial Russia was hierarchical, autocratic, and often xenophobic, and foreigners of all backgrounds could face suspicion. The African presence remained minuscule, and Gannibal's story stood out precisely because it was unusual. When Peter the Great died, Gannibal's fortunes fluctuated with court politics. He experienced exile and rehabilitation before finally securing his rank. His trajectory reminds you that even exceptional inclusion was fragile, contingent on power shifts, never guaranteed by principle. Then, in 1917, the Romanov dynasty collapsed under the weight of war and revolution, and the Bolsheviks seized control, proclaiming a new ideology that rejected aristocracy and imperial conquest. Suddenly the narrative changed. Marxist theory framed colonialism as an extension of capitalist exploitation, and the new Soviet state positioned itself as an ally of the oppressed. Through the Comintern, Moscow reached beyond Europe, speaking directly to activists in Asia and Africa, encouraging anti-colonial movements and promising solidarity. This was not the language of patronage or novelty, as in Gannibal's era. It was the language of ideology, of historical struggle, of global alignment against Western imperialism. Yet even here, nuance is essential. The early Soviet Union faced its own internal crises, famines, purges, and forced collectivization campaigns that devastated millions. Its foreign outreach was shaped by survival and strategic calculation as much as by idealism. When African intellectuals and activists began corresponding with Moscow in the interwar years, they encountered a state eager to undermine British and French influence. A state willing to offer training, literature, and rhetorical support. Black American activists, too, visited the Soviet Union, some drawn by its official denunciations of racism and segregation in the United States. Soviet propaganda contrasted lynchings in the American South with proclamations of socialist equality, crafting an image of moral superiority that resonated globally. But image and lived experience did not always align perfectly. Within Soviet society, racial diversity remained limited, and attitudes among ordinary citizens could vary widely. The official line condemned racism, but prejudice did not vanish by decree. Still, compared to Jim Crow America or European colonial rule, the Soviet Union could plausibly argue that it had not built an overseas racial empire, and that distinction became a powerful diplomatic tool as decolonization accelerated after World War II. So when African nations began achieving independence in the 1950s and 1960s, Moscow stepped forward not as an old imperial master, but as a rival superpower offering partnership. The memory of Ganabal was sometimes invoked symbolically, proof that Russia had historical ties to Africa, that a black man had once risen to noble rank under a Russian czar, but the real engine was geopolitical competition. The Cold War turned continents into chessboards, and Africa, rich in resources and strategic location, became central terrain. The shift from a single African noble in the 18th century to thousands of African students in Soviet universities in the 20th did not represent a smooth moral evolution. It represented changing global conditions. Imperial Russia had little incentive to cultivate African alliances beyond court diplomacy. The Soviet Union, locked in ideological rivalry with the West, had every incentive to present itself as champion of anti-colonial struggle. The through line is not racial openness in a modern liberal sense. It is adaptation, the ability of a state to reposition itself depending on the world order it inhabits. And so the snow of St. Petersburg and the red banners of Moscow belong to different eras, but they reveal a pattern. Russia's engagement with people of African descent has often been symbolic at first, strategic at scale, and always shaped by power. In 1960, as drums echoed through newly independent capitals in Africa and colonial flags were lowered one by one, another flag rose quietly in Moscow above a new institution built with deliberate symbolism. The People's Friendship University, later renamed after Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese leader whose assassination shocked the decolonizing world. And when the first wave of African students stepped off planes into the cold Russian air, they were not arriving as curiosities in a royal court. They were arriving as future engineers, doctors, officers, and political leaders, invited under banners that proclaimed equality, solidarity, and anti-imperial brotherhood. You can picture them walking across Red Square, coats pulled tight against winter, hearing Russian spoken around them, carrying textbooks instead of chains. And for many it felt like stepping into an alternative universe, one where the official narrative rejected colonial hierarchy and framed black liberation movements as part of a global socialist struggle. The Soviet Union did not simply speak, it acted. Military advisors were dispatched to Angola and Mozambique as those nations fought against Portuguese rule and later internal conflict. Ethiopian officers trained in Soviet academies. Thousands of African students received scholarships covering tuition, housing, stipends. Soviet doctors and engineers worked in African capitals. Weapons shipments flowed into liberation movements aligned with Marxist ideology. Cuban troops, backed by Soviet support, fought in Angola. This was no longer symbolic patronage like Peter the Great's protection of Ganabal. This was systemic engagement backed by state resources. The language was powerful. Soviet media portrayed African revolutionaries as comrades resisting Western exploitation. Posters showed clasped hands, African and Soviet, under slogans of unity. Speeches at the United Nations condemned apartheid in South Africa and segregation in the United States. In this ideological theater, Moscow positioned itself as morally distinct from former colonial empires. It emphasized that Russia had not built transatlantic slave plantations, had not divided Africa into colonies at the Berlin Conference. That historical distance became diplomatic leverage. For many African leaders navigating the treacherous terrain of Cold War alignment, the Soviet Union offered tangible benefits without the baggage of direct colonial rule. Ghana, Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and others engaged with Moscow in varying degrees. Students who studied engineering in Kiev or medicine in Leningrad returned home with degrees and technical skills that were urgently needed in post-colonial states. Some formed lifelong bonds with Soviet classmates. Some married and built families. The relationship was real, material, and transformative for thousands of individuals. But power rarely moves without calculation. Soviet engagement in Africa was not purely humanitarian. Each alliance represented influence in a continent where the United States and former European powers were also competing. Access to ports, minerals, strategic airspace. These mattered in global rivalry. Military training strengthened governments that declared socialist orientation. Intelligence networks expanded. Ideological alignment translated into votes in international forums. The rhetoric of solidarity intertwined with the logic of superpower strategy, and lived experience could diverge from official slogans. African students in Soviet cities sometimes reported incidents of prejudice from ordinary citizens unaccustomed to racial diversity. While the state condemned racism publicly, social attitudes did not always align perfectly with ideology. The presence of black students in Moscow, Kiev, or Minsk was visible, sometimes welcomed, sometimes met with curiosity or discomfort. The Soviet system could denounce American segregation, while still grappling with its own social blind spots. Yet compared to the racial violence of Jim Crow America, or the brutality of apartheid South Africa, the Soviet Union's official stance against colonial racism resonated deeply with many in the global South. It presented a narrative of partnership rather than domination. For a generation of African leaders educated in Moscow, the USSR represented not perfection, but possibility, a counterweight to Western influence. The contrast with Imperial Russia becomes stark here. In Gannibal's time, one African man rose within an overwhelmingly homogeneous empire through personal patronage. In the Cold War, thousands of Africans arrived under state-sponsored programs designed to cultivate alliances. The scale had changed. The context had changed. The motivation had changed, but the threat of Russia engaging people of African descent in moments of global transition remained visible. From Addis Ababa to Luanda, Soviet advisors walked through government buildings advising on infrastructure, military planning, and education. In Angola's civil war, Soviet-backed forces battled Western-backed factions in a conflict that drew in Cuba and South Africa. The Cold War in Africa was not abstract. It was fought with weapons, ideology, and training programs that tied Moscow to African capitals in ways unimaginable in Peter the Great's era. And yet this alignment was never unconditional or permanent. African leaders balanced relationships between East and West. Some shifted allegiance, some grew wary of overdependence. Soviet resources were vast, but not limitless. And beneath the banners of solidarity, geopolitical interest always lingered. Still, for a brief period in the mid to late 20th century, Moscow stood as a symbol to many across Africa of an alternative path, a superpower that had not colonized them, that educated their students, armed their movements, and condemned racial apartheid on the global stage. Whether that image was fully deserved or strategically crafted is part of the tension that defines this chapter. The boy in the snow beside Peter the Great had once embodied Russia's openness as an imperial curiosity. Now, African officers in Soviet uniforms, African students in Moscow dormitories, embodied something larger, a state attempting to redefine its global role through anti-colonial partnership. But history never freezes in a single posture, and the alliance forged in the heat of Cold War rivalry would face its own test as the Soviet Union itself began to weaken. By the late 1980s, the red banners that once stretched confidently across Africa began to lose their wind, and in Moscow the certainty of superpower permanence started to crack, because the Soviet Union itself was unraveling under economic strain, political reform, and internal dissent. And when a state built on ideological projection begins to weaken at home, its global commitments become harder to sustain abroad. African students still walked the halls of universities in Moscow and Kiev. Military advisors still operated in parts of Africa, but funding tightened, priorities shifted, and the vast network of alliances that had once symbolized anti-colonial solidarity now depended on a system struggling to hold itself together. You can imagine an African student who arrived in the early 1980s, believing in the strength of the socialist bloc, watching news broadcasts as reforms under Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika exposed internal problems that propaganda had once masked. The Soviet Union had presented itself as a stable alternative to Western capitalism. Yet now grocery shelves thinned, political debates erupted, and republics inside the USSR began asserting independence. For African governments reliant on Soviet military equipment, training, or economic aid, uncertainty crept in. What happens when your superpower ally can no longer guarantee support? When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in 1991, the transformation was abrupt. The Russian Federation that emerged inherited diplomatic ties, but not the same ideological mission. Many aid programs collapsed. Military advisors withdrew. Scholarships diminished. African students already enrolled often completed their studies, but the grand narrative of global socialist solidarity faded rapidly. What had once been framed as a historic alignment between Moscow and African liberation movements now appeared in hindsight, as a chapter shaped heavily by Cold War rivalry. The lived experiences of those who passed through that era remain complex. Some African graduates of Soviet institutions went on to hold influential positions in their home countries. They carried with them fluency in Russian, technical training, and memories of a country that had welcomed them under banners of friendship. Others recalled moments of discrimination or cultural isolation. Soviet citizens, for their part, had encountered African peers in numbers unprecedented in Russian history, challenging assumptions in a society that had rarely experienced racial diversity on a large scale. This is where the tension between narrative and reality becomes most visible. Imperial Russia could point to Ganable as proof that a black man had risen to noble rank under a czar, yet his ascent did not signal broad racial inclusion. The Soviet Union could point to its support of African liberation and its educational programs as evidence of anti-racist solidarity, yet those initiatives were inseparable from geopolitical strategy. In both eras, engagement with the people of African descent carried symbolic power that exceeded the numbers involved. And still, something did change across those centuries. In Ganable's time, the presence of a single African at court was extraordinary enough to be remembered in portraits and memoirs. By the 1960s and 1970s, African students in Moscow were no longer singular anomalies. They were part of organized state programs. The scale and visibility had expanded dramatically. The motivation had shifted from personal patronage to ideological competition. The context had moved from imperial court politics to global superpower rivalry. But Russia never became a multicultural society in the way some Western nations did through mass migration from former colonies. The African diaspora in Russia remained relatively small. Engagement was often structured through state channels, military, educational, diplomatic, rather than through organic migration flows. And when the Soviet system collapsed, much of that structured engagement receded with it. So what does this story reveal when viewed as a whole? It reveals that Russia's relationship with people of African descent was never linear, never defined by a continuous policy of racial inclusion or exclusion, but shaped instead by moments when global power dynamics made such relationships strategically valuable. An African child at the court of Peter the Great symbolized Russia's aspiration toward European modernity. African liberation movements supported by Moscow symbolized the Soviet Union's aspiration toward global ideological leadership. In both cases, black presence intersected with Russian ambition. The question was never simply whether Russia opened up to black people. It was how and why it engaged them when doing so aligned with its broader vision of itself as a reforming empire in the 18th century, as an anti-colonial superpower in the 20th. And when those visions shifted or faltered, the intensity of that engagement shifted with them. Today, echoes of that history linger in diplomatic ties between Russia and African nations, in alumni networks of former Soviet universities, in cultural memories passed down through families who once studied or trained in Moscow. The Cold War is over, the empire long gone, yet the symbolic bridge from Ganable to Lumumba University remains part of a larger narrative about how states craft identity through their relationships with the outside world. From a boy brought across continents to stand in a frozen imperial court, to thousands of students crossing continents under red banners of solidarity, the arc is not one of simple openness or simple exclusion. It is an arc of adaptation, of a nation redefining itself in different eras through selective engagement with people far beyond its borders. And in that arc, you see how power tells stories about itself, how it chooses which lives to elevate as symbols, and how those symbols can endure long after the political systems that created them have disappeared. In the end, the story does not belong to a single empire or a single ideology, but to the space between image and intention, between symbolism and structure. Because when you place Abram Ganable beneath the chandeliers of Peter the Great's court, and then place African students beneath the red banners of Soviet Moscow, you are not looking at a straight line of racial openness. You are looking at two moments when Russia turned outward and found it useful, even powerful, to redefine itself through its relationship with people the West had historically marginalized or colonized. Ganable's rise did not dismantle imperial hierarchy, but it projected sophistication, modernity, and difference from Atlantic slave empires. Soviet support for African liberation did not eliminate geopolitical calculation, but it projected moral contrast with Western colonialism. In both cases, the engagement was real, documented and consequential, yet always entangled with state ambition. The African boy who became a Russian general embodied personal transformation within a rigid imperial world, and his legacy lived on in Russian literature and memory through Pushkin, weaving Africa quietly into Russia's cultural DNA. 2 centuries later, African officers trained in Soviet academies. African doctors graduated from Moscow universities. African leaders negotiated arms and infrastructure deals with Kremlin officials. And for a time, the Soviet Union stood visibly beside liberation movements, challenging apartheid and colonial rule. Those connections altered lives, influenced wars, shaped careers, and left marks on both sides. But when the structures that supported those connections shifted, when czars died, When revolutions overturned monarchies, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the intensity of engagement shifted too. What remained were fragments, portraits, memoirs, alumni networks, diplomatic ties, and the memory of moments when Russia positioned itself as something other than a European imperial power. The pattern reveals less about inherent racial ideology and more about how states construct identity in response to global forces. Russia's limited involvement in the Atlantic slave trade allowed it later to claim moral distance from Western colonialism. Its revolutionary ideology allowed it to speak the language of anti-imperialism. Its strategic interests ensured that solidarity was never purely symbolic. So when we ask how Russia tried to open up to black people, the answer is layered. It opened selectively, symbolically, strategically. It elevated individuals when it suited imperial vision. It invited students and armed movements when it suited Cold War rivalry. It offered partnership framed as equality, while navigating its own internal contradictions. The story is not one of pure inclusion or pure manipulation, but of historical context shaping engagement across centuries. And perhaps the most enduring image is not one of snow or red flags alone, but of movement. A child taken across continents into a new court. Students flying across hemispheres into a new ideology. Journeys shaped by power, opportunity, ambition, and circumstance. These journeys remind us that nations, like individuals, tell stories about themselves through the relationships they choose to highlight. Sometimes those stories reveal genuine exchange. Sometimes they reveal strategy dressed as solidarity. Often they reveal both. From imperial anomaly to superpower strategy, Russia's relationship with people of African descent was never static. It shifted with the tides of empire, revolution, and global rivalry. And in those shifts, we see not a simple narrative of racial openness, but a complex reflection of how power seeks legitimacy by aligning itself, at critical moments, with those standing at the crossroads of history.